Dear friends, I am most happy to inform you that we have successfully completed full 6 months of non-stop holding of lectures. We started on 4th October with a missionary zeal to make history understandable to all, to help our young understand what our shared past was, and to make the general people comprehend that there is only one way to access the past, and that is through its authentic primary sources. I am proud to say that we did contribute towards what we had aimed, and we did carve out a niche for ourselves. Our success lies in the fact that you did not leave us, but kept watching week after week. Yes, we have had days when our themes might not have sounded so popular, but we did try to expose you to all kinds of approaches and all kinds of topics. Today, continuing our endeavors, we bring before you yet another scholar with a fresh theme, history and literature. And to explain that relationship, I have with me my friend Professor Asim Siddiqui, who is a former chairman of the Department of English, AMU. Professor Muhammad Asim Siddiqui has worked on American novelist Mark Twain for his doctoral thesis. He is not only very passionate about his teaching, but loves to interact with his students in and outside the classroom. His areas of interests and publications include literary theory, 19th and 20th century English and American fiction, South Asian literature, film studies, and research methods in the humanities. His most recent book is a monograph on Shahryar, which has been published this very year, 2021, by Sahitya Academy, and it is a part of a series known as Makers of Indian Literature. Professor Siddiqui was a Fulbright Fellow at New York University in 2007. He has regularly contributed research articles and book reviews to journals and books and has been writing prolifically on arts and culture for different newspapers, magazines, and news portals. They include The Guardian, The Hindu, Hindustan Times, Statesman, Rediff.com, Scroll.in, NDTV, Frontline, India Today magazine, the book review, Biblio, and many, many others. He also translates from Urdu and Hindi into English, and his translations have been published in many books and journals. He is the managing editor of the Urdu translation of complete works of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, a project of Dr. Ambedkar Foundation, Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, Government of India. Presently, he is also hosting a fortnightly program on English books on Urdu literature and language for Anjuman Taraqi Urdu Hind. Let me also inform you at the end that among the AMU teachers, he was one of the first to start with the online lecture concept. He was, in fact, one of those who very prominently started giving lectures to his students at a time when the universities were all closed. Today, he will be delivering a talk on literature, a window for history. Over to you, Professor Asim Siddiqui.
Thank you very much, Professor Rajiv Rizvi, for a very generous introduction. And I especially like the last sentence because that is something that is more relevant, and that is why we are here, say, using this platform and, of course, turning this crisis into a kind of opportunity. No political meanings in this last phrase, but certainly this has given us a chance to listen to some wonderful speakers, and of course, this particular platform has really provided opportunity to senior academics like me, and of course younger students also, to listen to some very exciting lectures. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for giving me this platform to interact with the students, and of course, I mean, others. I'm aware that most of the listeners today, they are students of history, and of course some are also of other stream, but I'm sure that this talk will be useful to them, right? So the topic today is very interesting. I'm sharing my screen so that the points that I'm discussing, they can be seen by others also, right? So can you see my screen?
Not yet. Uh,
Okay.
there'll be an option of share screen, and on that share window. So go to
Okay.
share window
Okay. Okay.
on the StreamYard itself.
Right. Right. Right.
Professor Siddiqui, let me walk you through this. Um, yeah, this is perfect. Please make your
Can you see?
screen full screen, please.
Yeah. Can you see now?
Yeah,
Yes,
but
just
make it full screen.
F4.
Is it better?
No, press F4. Fine, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Is it? Is it
It's
visible?
visible, but it would have been better if it would have been full screen. नीचे जो वो बना हुआ है उसको दबा के देखो ना. स्क्रीन बनी हुई होगी जो तुम्हारे इसके ऊपर बनी हुई है.
Hmm.
No, you have changed the. Yeah. Okay, then carry on.
Okay. Okay. We begin with this very basic question: what exactly is literature? And of course, I'll just speak a minute about this, because we are talking about this relationship between literature and history, and we know that now literature and history actually are taught in different faculties. So literature is part of faculty of arts, and usually history is taught in social sciences department, but of course we use a common word, the humanities. So here, one important question is there really a difference between literature and literary study? Is there a difference between methods used in natural sciences and literary study? I am raising these questions because often this question has been asked: what exactly is the nature of literary study, and can methods which are used in sciences, can these methods be used in the study of literature? And in fact, here attempts have also been made to write literary history using certain principles. I'm just recalling one important literary history by Lewin Kazamian, which was written with a particular thesis. And the thesis was, it tried to see conflict between two ideas, and how this kind of conflict between two ideas, or two different rhythms of English society, were visible or were to be seen in different literary periods. Of course, this was not accepted by everyone, and it remains debatable whether there can be any law of literary history. Similarly, the other question is, does literature emphasize the general or the particular? Because if we are talking about a writer, say for example, if we are talking about Shakespeare or Wordsworth, then obviously we study Shakespeare because there is something unique about Shakespeare, because there is something distinct about Shakespeare's work. And just as there is something distinct about Wordsworth's work. And at the same time, we also read Shakespeare because Shakespeare is part of Elizabethan culture, part of Elizabethan ethos, and part of Elizabethan drama. So, in a way, Shakespeare has a distinct place, but Shakespeare also is part of what was being written during the Elizabethan period. So, that way, we see the uniqueness, that is fine. But at the same time, we also make this point that it is not complete particularity which is important in literature or in literary studies, but rather it is individuality which is important. Now, moving on to this particular question, and say literature as window for history. We know that this particular say topic has many questions, many assumptions, and many threads. I'll just talk about some of these threads in great detail, and other threads I'll just mention. So, for example, if we see one important thread in this topic, then we can say that, of course, history has been written on the basis of literary text. There is a long tradition of using literary text, and of course, historians have been using literary text. And if we just broaden our concept of literature, say, for example, when we talk about literature, not in the sense in which we are using the word now, but rather literature in a more comprehensive manner, where sometimes it can include very different kinds of writings, then we can apply this definition of literature to number of works written during the Vedic period. And for that matter, if you see the form of writing in many of those Vedic texts, then you'll see that, of course, they are literary in nature. I don't think I need to discuss this particular point because this is a point which has been discussed, debated, a lot has been written about, and of course, historians know this particular point say so well. Then, of course, there is another important assumption here, and that assumption is that there is a big corpus of literature, but here the unsaid part is that this corpus of literature also includes not only literature which is there in the form of writing, but it also includes what is called oral literature. That means, say, all those folklores, all those folk songs, all those ballads, all those epics. So there are many things which have been handed down to us through speech, through oral traditions, and many of those things have been transcribed, but they still are considered part of oral literature. So obviously, oral literature is another great resource for literary historians, and it's a great resource for historians. So again, this is another say important subject, but probably I don't need to discuss this particular subject here. Otherwise, it will distract me from the main concern of this particular topic. And the third point is, and this is extremely important, and this is probably more relevant here. Literature can provide a form and life to certain historical details which are of little interest to historians. Now, let me ask a question. And of course, you don't have to answer this question, but try to just think about this question. The question is, when you have read history books, then how much of your own life have you seen reflected in history that you have read? I'm talking about textbooks, I'm talking about many other books of history which we all love to read. And the question is, do you find your own life reflected in those history books? Do you find that something which is very, very specific to you, something which is very, very distinct about you, something which is very, very individual, is that somehow reflected in those history books? And it is here, then literature becomes more important, and it becomes extremely important. And so here one important observation that can be made is literature writes the history of man as against historiography, which is interested in the history of society or larger groups. You read any history, history is usually not the history of one single person, but rather history is a history of society or larger configurations or larger groups. So you also have those national projects of history writing. You also have those communal projects of history writing. You also have some of those statist narratives. In other words, when we are talking about history of man or history of an individual or history of one person or history of say men in general, then probably we turn to literature. And here we can refer to two beautiful constructions which were given to us by Milan Kundera. Let me just introduce my students to Milan Kundera. Milan Kundera is an important novelist who writes in French. Actually, he is a Czech exile. That means he was a native of Czechoslovakia, but then he moved from Czechoslovakia and he has written in French, and he has established himself as a very important novelist. In Milan Kundera's work, actually history is very important, and especially number of his works talk about the invasion of Czechoslovakia by Russia. That means that particular period when Czechoslovakia was under the Soviet control. So that particular period is often examined by Milan Kundera. And his novels are also remarkable for treating many historical themes. He shares some common grounds with another major writer, Frank Kafka, because Kafka also talks about certain issues, certain themes, and here the theme of power is especially important. Milan Kundera talks about history, but he often says that there is very little that is there by way of history in his works. In other words, he's saying that he is talking about history, but he provides only very few details, and he is very selective in presenting those historical details in his work. And he also makes another very interesting observation that in order to read my works, you don't need to read history books. That means whatever history my readers need to know, that is already there in my novels. So a reader does not have to go to history books to better understand Milan Kundera's works. But of course, we can also take this particular observation with a pinch of salt, because writers often make certain pronouncements, and it is not always necessary that we accept all those pronouncements which are made by the writers. And it is not that we cannot always disagree with them. But here, let us talk about this particular aspect. Milan Kundera makes this observation that there are two different kinds of novels when it comes to the treatment of history. There are novels which examine historical dimension of human existence, and this is a very important observation. I'll explain this. And the other kind of novel is which is a kind of illustration of a historical situation, the description of a society at a given moment. Probably historians will find something, say, very useful in the second kind of novel, where a particular situation, a particular historical situation is providing material, or it provides material to the novelist. So, for example, there may be a novel about partition, there may be a novel about 9/11, there may be a novel about any other historical situation. And that way, the novel provides a kind of history which historians will present in history books. Somehow, Milan Kundera considers this kind of novel an inferior variety. He doesn't say it in so many words, but his view is that if somebody has to know something about a historical situation, then he would rather read a history book, because novel has a particular kind of form, and novel has a particular kind of raison d'etre. Novel has a particular kind of purpose, and as a particular kind of form, novel should say, and novel says what only novel can say, not which a history textbook cannot probably say. So this is one important observation, and but this categorization helps us understand number of novels, and when can we can think about number of novels, some which I have read and some which you might have read, and you can probably categorize those novels as illustrating a certain historical situation. On the other hand, the first kind of novel, which is Milan Kundra's kind of novel, which examines historical dimension of human existence. And here he is interested in the existential dimension of self, existential dimension of self. So sometimes history intervenes at a particular moment in the life of a character, and then that particular movement is very important because it defines his whole existential self. Here I'm giving you two examples from Milan Kundra's own works. There is a novel titled The Farewell Party. The Farewell Party. Now in that novel, Milan Kundra describes a particular situation. Not exactly a situation, but rather he thinks about a situation. And what is that situation? The situation is that just before the annexation.
Professor Siddiqui, your slides are stuck on slide number one.
No, I'm just speaking about it, right?
Okay,
I'll
okay.
just. This is slide number one. No, okay. Uh, I'm talking about Milan Kundera talks about two different kinds of novels. I think this slide is visible.
Yes, now it is visible.
Yes, yes. So I was talking about these two, say, different kinds of observations where you may have a novel which illustrates a historical situation, but the first kind of novel which examines historical dimension of human existence is something which interests Milan Kundera. And I was talking about two examples from two of his works. One important work is The Farewell Party. In that work, in that work, say, Kundra uses a particular kind of setting, but that setting is suggested by one historical event, and that historical event actually did not interest historians as such, but it interested Milan Kundra as a novelist. The incident was that just before the annexation of Czechoslovakia by Soviet Union, say, number of dogs in Prague, they were killed. So just see this small detail which can be lost, maybe which may not even figure in a newspaper write-up. But here, killing of dogs and kind of systematic killing of dogs is something which interested a novelist, and it helped him provide a kind of setting for his novel. The other interesting detail also comes from Milan Kundra, and that interesting detail is from his novel Life is Elsewhere. In this novel, he sketches a character, a young character, and in fact, he also parodies the romantic aspirations of this character. There is one particular scene in this novel that this character, his name is Jaromil, he is very eagerly waiting for a romantic alliance. And when he actually has that particular moment, and this particular movement of romantic union with a girl happens in the novel, and he thinks about undressing at that moment, but suddenly he thinks about his shorts, he thinks about his undershorts, and his undershorts are actually very shabby, they are very inelegant. But here Kundra is making this point that at that time, in that particular place, only that kind of inelegant and shabby undershorts were available. That means there were no others to be had. So if the character felt embarrassed about it, if the character felt bad about it, and he stopped himself, say, from that romantic union. Now, here history intervenes at a particular moment in his life, but this particular moment may not be of any interest to historians, but here it captured the attention of a novelist. So here, because Kundera's concern is the existential self, and his concern is a particular character whose existential self he tries to probe. And so here, this minor detail of history, which is not even important for most people, becomes important for him. Now, if we move from here to the next slide, and this, I'm sorry, just a minute. Yes. Okay, so this was the third important dimension. Now we think about the fourth important dimension of this particular question. The fourth important dimension is probably closer to this topic. And here the idea is that literature can corroborate other historical records. Literature can corroborate other historical records. And here I would like to introduce two very recent or reasonably recent movements in literary studies. And these two movements are New Historicism and Cultural Materialism. Now, interesting thing about New Historicism is that it teaches us certain things about literary interpretation. Now, certain things appear very, very commonplace. And what is that commonplace observation? That a particular work of literature must be placed in its historical context. That history of that particular time becomes important if we want to understand a work. Now, a simple observation like this was not always part of literary scholarship, or not the dominant part of literary scholarship, because there have been many different ways of interpreting literary texts, and one way of literary interpretation was to consider a literary work a self-sufficient entity. In other words, it was considered a kind of verbal icon where it was sufficient in itself, where one did not need the biography of a writer or the history of the times to understand a particular work. Here, simply the idea is that a writer may talk about his intentions. He can say that, okay, I'm trying to write the history of 19th century in this novel. So this may be his intention, but it is not always that he succeeds in writing that particular thing which he intends to write. And that's why literary intention has always been taken with a pinch of salt in literary interpretation. The other aspect of this is that, okay, one may try to write something, but what actually one succeeded in writing, that becomes more important, right? So here, new historicism or historical study of a work may appear a very commonplace kind of observation, but it has not always been a very dominant method in literary studies. But certainly history was used to place a work in context. And there is one very famous work which talks about the Elizabethan world, a work by E.W. Tilliard. That work was titled Elizabethan World Picture, right? And what happens is that new historicists or critics who are using the tools of new historicism, they depart from that view. They depart from that view which considered literature a kind of self-sufficient entity. Here, two interesting phrases can probably define their venture. They are interested in the textuality of history, and they are interested in the historicity of text. I repeat, they are interested in the textuality of history, and they are interested in the historicity of text. Now, here the idea is that history, for, for that matter, history also follows certain tropes. History also follows certain forms of narratives. Here's the idea is that history also follows many of those themes, many of those tropes, many of those formal features which you can see in literary works. And that's why history has that very important element of textuality. When we say textuality, and if we possibly extend this observation to an extreme and we think about, say, deconstructionist historians like, say, White, then probably we'll be taking things a bit too far. But here, important thing is that history has many of those elements of textuality, and literature has always been marked by its textuality. That means text consisting of words, text consisting of tropes, text consisting of metaphors, text consisting of, say, figures, text consisting of many of those rhetorical devices. So that is one important thing, that history has textuality and literature has historicity. That means any work of literature also is written at a particular point of time. But here they added another observation to this, that any work of literature is also read at a particular point of time. That means you always have this history of not only of the writing of history, writing of literature, but also of reception of history and reception of those literary texts. So new historicism actually heralded a very different kind of approach. And here, new historicism has greatly borrowed from Michel Foucault's ideas. And you know that Foucault also has a very interesting place in history. Many of our traditional historians actually have reservations about Foucault, but we still learn a few things from Foucault. We know that Foucault is a theorist of power. He talks about power, he talks about discursive formations. But in this particular case, what are certain observations of Foucault which are relevant? One particular observation is that he talks about history as a kind of discontinuous thing. That means one does not see a kind of linear progress, seamless movement in history, but rather history sometimes moves in lurches. That is Foucault's idea. You can always debate this idea. So, this is one idea which new historicism borrows from. Similarly, the other important idea is that any given period is a site of conflict. That means there are always competing ideologies, competing discourses, competing worldviews, which in fact jostle for primacy. So here, this is a second important aspect. That means we do not have a very seamless, round view of a particular period, something that was given by that famous book, Elizabethan World Picture. On the other hand, any period is a site of conflict. And the third important point is Foucault talks about role and function of power. That means here, to very briefly say explain this point, he does not have a unidirectional view of power. That means power coming from above. For him, power is there in all situations. Power is there everywhere. Power comes from everywhere. Power comes from different directions. There is no human situation which is without that kind of power dimension. And so here, power is everywhere. This is his very important observation. Now, here, when we see some lessons from these three important, say, points which were developed by Foucault, then we see that new historicism talks about both literary and non-literary text, both literary and non-literary text. So that means here, usually in literature departments, literary texts were given a kind of primacy, but not in new historicism. What is important in new historicism, that they study not only literary texts, but they also study other texts of a given period. And here, the example of one very famous new historicist critic, Stephen Greenblatt, is instructive. When he studies Shakespeare, and I must mention this, that new historicism usually talks about texts produced during the Elizabethan period. That means many of those plays written by Shakespeare and his contemporaries, they are the chief concern of new historicists. So that means a lot of scholarship, say about Renaissance, has come from new historicists, a new scholarship. So when Stephen Greenblatt studies a particular text of Shakespeare, he also studies a particular trial which was held at that time. He also studies the report which was sent by an administrator, and the report of the state of Virginia. And he also studies, say, legal texts. In other words, when he studies these legal texts, when he studies these administrators' reports, right? When he studies, say, other documents which may have interested historians, and at the same time, he also studies literary texts to arrive at a kind of meaning. So, this is his method of reading a literary text, and how it departs from the established method, because earlier literary critics were not studying all these non-literary texts. So that means this distinction between literary and non-literary actually crumbles in the work of new historicists. Then there are, of course, other aspects of this also, and the other aspects of new historicist scholarship, which I don't think I need to discuss because they are not relevant, too relevant as far as the question of history is concerned. But certainly here they debunk this view of authorial genius, that an author is inspired and he writes something original. Rather, they make this point that an author is never free from the discourses circulating around him. That means whenever he is living, there are certain discourses, whether that discourse is legal or medical or any other, an author is very much a product of those discourses. So this idea of somebody being a genius, somebody being an inspired genius, it actually is debunked by new historicist critics. So when, for example, we study a work using this method, and when we say, for example, see Charles Dickens and his treatment of a child or his treatment of children, then it is not only his novels, but we would also study, say, for example, medical literature, what it says about children, and religious literature also, what about what it says about children. In other words, this, say, relationship between literary and the historical, literary and non-literary, it in fact gives insights to a critic. And the third important thing, of course, here is that come from this particular observation, that all established canons, say for example, somebody is a great poet, somebody is not a great poet, that established canon also receives a kind of beating. And so one discovers many new writers, and it gives space to some other, say, forms of writing. Because you know that Foucault's ideas, and especially if you think about many of his books, say for example History of Sexuality, then how he can open up this entire discourse, and how his work has provided, say, some kind of impetus to LGBT groups. It has provided impetus to feminist scholarship, and that's why the concept of canon which was restricted to some important writers, it has widened, it has broadened, and partly it is due to Foucault's influence also. So that means if we think about this whole new historicist project, we'll say that the critic gives the same emphasis to non-literary texts. And here, all those historical texts become suddenly very important for literary critics. New historicism and cultural materialism are often discussed together, and often they are considered allies. And if there are differences between these two different approaches, or sometimes some tussle also, then that tussle is considered a kind of family tussle. But one can say that new historicism draws critics usually from American Academy. It has traditionally drawn critics from American Academy. On the other hand, cultural materialism is much more influenced by Marxist critic Raymond Williams' ideas. And here, just two, three ideas of Williams are relevant to this entire discussion, are very relevant. Now, Raymond Williams talks about structure of feelings. Structure of feelings. Now, there is a difference between feeling and thinking. When we think something, that means we are conscious of that thing. That means that particular thing is articulated. That means that particular thing is written about. That means that particular thing finds expression in books, in articles. But when we think about feeling, it can be a very vague kind of feeling. It can be a kind of some kind of vague realization, right? So do feelings have a structure? This is the question. So Williams is talking about works of literature which can talk about certain ideas, which can talk about certain concepts, maybe before those concepts are thought logically, maybe before those concepts are analyzed properly, maybe before those concepts are discussed properly. That means they can exist as a structure of feelings in works of literature. Now, this very interesting observation can possibly open a new line of interpretation when we read Shakespeare, for that matter. So, for example, do we see some aspects of nascent capitalism in Shakespeare? Now, capitalism is not something which we associate with that particular period, but probably say the class structure was changing, probably royalty was giving way to new forces. Those new forces were emerging, but probably those forces were emerging not in a very systematic manner, but somehow some of those structures of feeling were there. I'm giving you one example from a text, Measure for Measure, which is written by Shakespeare. Now, Measure for Measure introduces a character who owns a brothel house. And actually, there was also a law which was passed at that time that all those brothel houses had to be moved away. Okay, that is a different line of interpretation. But what is important here is that early on, Shakespeare is introducing a character who is a kind of entrepreneur, and she's a woman, and she's a woman entrepreneur. Now, similarly, many other structures of feelings can be discovered in Shakespeare. And one can also talk about these structures of feelings in other works before some ideas are articulated, thought about, developed, written about, they can probably be there in literature, right? Here, three other very interesting, say, words which are used by Raymond Williams, and which, of course, are related to this concept of structure of feelings. Williams has a very dominant concept of culture, very dominant view of culture, something which is not static, of course. But what is important is he identifies three very important strands in culture. One important strand is the dominant strand. Probably we can use this analysis to our own times also, that maybe there are some aspects which are dominant, say everywhere you see them, whether you are following social media, whether you are reading newspapers, whether you are hearing those public speeches, you can probably see those dominant aspects of culture. But you can also see some residual aspects of culture. Residual means leftover, that means coming from an earlier period. And they are also there, they also exist. And some of those residual aspects actually are archaic aspects which probably are not relevant, right? But the third important aspect is extremely important. And the third important aspect is that you also have this aspect where something is emerging, and it emerges gradually. It emerges maybe as a thread, and maybe it can acquire a certain force. So when Williams talks about those structures of feelings, that means certain aspects of emergent cultures can also be seen, can also be glimpsed in those dominant aspects of culture. So capitalism may be a kind of emerging aspect, right? It is not thought over, but maybe some aspects of capitalism can be seen emerging at that time. So that means here Williams provides us a very useful kind of terminology, and this also probably help us read many works of literature. Now here we take up another very interesting question here, and that question is the case of biography, right? And you know that biography is a very important genre of writing, and of course many important historians, they have written biographies, and history biographers also qualify as historians, right? So here also uh, probably Shakespeare provides a very interesting example, right? But here the thing is, if we are talking about a writer who writes in the 20th century, or maybe in our times, or maybe in 19th century, then probably we have lot of information about that writer. So if we come across a literary biography, then obviously we have enough material about a writer, enough live details, his own writings, his own speeches, his own pronouncements, his own diaries, or maybe some other mundane records, say, for example, bills or wills, or say his interactions with others, his letters. That means you have all these important documents. But if we think about a writer who was writing in 16th century, and here we are talking about Shakespeare because Shakespeare's biography is probably one of the most interesting areas in literature. There are few puzzles, there are few, say, mysteries which are as interesting as probably Shakespeare's biography. And I will not be wrong if I say that thousands of Shakespeare's biographies have been written, right? So, and here I'm not exaggerating this number. So much so that there is also one particular line in Shakespeare's biographies, one particular thread in Shakespeare's biographies, and that thread is whether there was really a man called William Shakespeare. And this question has been asked by a different kind of question. And the question is, who wrote Shakespeare? Who wrote Shakespeare? That means all those plays which are attributed to Shakespeare, were they really written by Shakespeare? Were they really written by the person called Shakespeare? Right. And actually, there is some doubt, and there was great doubt about this, and consequently number of books were written which talked about Shakespeare's biography. I am sure many of you have heard a very very tired, say, kind of joke in India also, that actually Shakespeare was not Shakespeare, His name was William Sheikh Piru. There is something in this joke also. If you say that Shakespeare was not Shakespeare, but he was William Sheikh Piru, because different identities for Shakespeare have been invented, different identities, and sometimes some important historical figures have been projected as the real Shakespeares. And some of those important figures are Christopher Marlowe, of course, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare, and the other is Francis Bacon. And actually, the reason for that doubt was that Shakespeare's life, whatever facts of Shakespeare's life are known, that Shakespeare was a kind of Shakespeare borrowed money also, Shakespeare lent money also, Shakespeare was a builder, and Shakespeare say did some small businesses, and somehow all these things, all these mundane things, that Shakespeare also is very particular about giving money, and if somebody does not return his money, then he can also take that person to court. And Shakespeare say is interested many of those worldly things. So somehow this picture, this mundane picture of Shakespeare, does not quite harmonize with that great writer who wrote those great tragedies, those comedies, those historical plays. Because it means that only a person who has seen royalty can describe royalty. Only a person who has traveled different lands can possibly write about all those different locales which you can see in Shakespeare's plays. So here what happens is that when a biographer is forced to write a biography of Shakespeare, what sources is he supposed to use? And here, two different kinds of approaches in Shakespeare's biography have been seen. One is that many writers have used Shakespeare's works, Shakespeare's works to get a glimpse of Shakespeare's life. That means if I am writing a biography of Shakespeare and if not enough documents are available with which I can construct a biography of Shakespeare, then I would turn to Shakespeare's plays and to see whether those plays can offer some clues to me. Now, this is a question of crucial importance. Why? Because often we can read works of literature to see the views of the writer, to see certain details about a writer's life. Is it justified always? Is it always proper? Is it always correct? There is no easy answer to this. It is a complex issue, because if we consider writers' works as very important resources for what the writer believed in, then probably we are trying to consider all literature as confessional. That means all literature is written in confessional mode, which is not always the case. So here, this is a complex issue. But then it is also true that behind all those works which we identify with the writer, there is also a man, there is also a worldview, there is also a consciousness, there is also a person. That person may have used a literary persona, that person may have invented dramatic situations, but then that thing is there. So that means this particular say question, how far is the biographer justified in using the evidence of the works for his purposes? It has no easy answers. It presupposes that all art is confessional, but all art is not always confessional, right? The second important question in biography, and which is also an important question, how far the results of literary biography relevant and important for an understanding of the works themselves. That means when we know the facts of a writer's life and we start looking for all those factors, all those facts, their fictional account in his works, their fictional account in his poetry. So, are we justified in doing that? And here also the answer is that a writer may use material from his life, but often that material changes its form, it changes its color, it changes its dimension, and often that material is transmuted into art form. That means it changes its shape completely, so much so that the original cannot be discovered easily. But as I just now said, that there are things, there is a consciousness behind a work. So despite problems, these two methods continue to be used in literary scholarship and also in historical scholarship. But here, let me just give you one very interesting information. There is one very important, say, book written by James Shapiro. The book is titled The Contested Will. Contested Will, actually, it refers to Shakespeare's own will, which he wrote. And that will actually is one of the early documents which the man Shakespeare is associated with. That means which was discovered, and gradually many other documents will also be discovered. And of course, uh, now the literary consensus is not the consensus in Shakespeare scholarship is that there was a man called Shakespeare. There was no conflict between these two different roles. Shakespeare as businessman who looks very ordinary, somebody who is interested in money, and that great writer who wrote those wonderful plays and who was a very good judge of human nature. So that means there is no conflict between these two different roles. It was the same person. This is a kind of consensus which is very much there in Shakespeare scholarship. But here there have been many books, many attempts where documents were forged, where entire books were written, which in fact were cases of forgeries, to suggest that, okay, this is Shakespeare's manuscript. I discovered this, and then the entire world took notice of that. And here, one such controversy was that there was one particular writer who wrote a book on Shakespeare, who wrote a biography of Shakespeare, and it was accepted by everyone. But then James Shapiro, he himself was actually studying some of those papers which were used to write that biography. Right. Now James Shapiro came across, actually James Shapiro was interested in this question. When did this controversy, who wrote Shakespeare, start? That means this controversy was not there in Shakespeare's time. This controversy was not there in first 200 years of Shakespeare's life. So how is it that this controversy, who wrote Shakespeare, started 200 years after Shakespeare's death? And he explored this issue, and then he came across, say, one particular critic, Cowell, who had certain papers, and Cowell heard certain things about somebody else, and then he had those papers. So Shapiro actually tried to explore those papers, and when he read those papers, he did not find anything amiss in them. But suddenly, when he was reading one particular part of a text, and there he came across a sentence like this, that how unromantic it was. It was such an unromantic business that a person who wrote all those plays, he would retire to his small town and sell wine. Just see this. A person, a great person, a great playwright, who wrote all those plays. At the peak of his career, he retires to a town. He goes to his town and he leaves behind his entire reputation, and he starts doing some kind of business in wine. It was a very unromantic business, very unromantic business. Now, when Shapiro read this phrase, unromantic business, suddenly he had a view, he had an idea. And the idea is that the time when this particular text was written, 19th century, actually, this particular word unromantic was not used in that sense at that time. So the early part of the 19th century, some of the word unromantic was not used. So how one particular word gave a clue to Shapiro, and then he suddenly saw there were other details in that text which probably appeared to him spurious. But this important expression, unromantic business, which was not used at that particular time when this particular text was written, it gave Shapiro this idea that actually this text was forged, and this was forged in 20th century, and probably the forger was still living, and the forger probably did that thing for whatever reasons one could never guess. So here, this is just one example of forgery, and he also narrates many other examples of forgery. There was one particular, say, gentleman called Ireland. He forged entire manuscripts of Shakespeare, and sometimes also gave a brilliant performance by showing that okay, he wrote this. So here, the point that I am trying to explain is that sometimes history of words or a particular word or some kind of probing on a particular word can also reveal, say, a wealth of information, say, focusing on one particular word. And that's why somebody like Edward Said in his lectures made a very strong case for philology, because philology in fact takes interest in this historical dimension of language. The other say reference is from one very famous text of Shakespeare, that is Hamlet. You know that Hamlet is probably the most stage play of Shakespeare, and I'm sure that all of you have read Hamlet. In Hamlet, you must have seen it staged also. There is a ghost, Hamlet's father's ghost. Now, Hamlet's father's ghost wants Hamlet to avenge his death, and he delivers long speeches, and in one speech he says remember me, and in fact in his speeches this word remember me is repeated, remember me, remember me, remember me. Very innocuous kind of expression, but it again has wealth of information. And what is that wealth of information that this these two words contain? That wealth of information is what was the religion of Prince Hamlet, and what was the religion of Hamlet the senior, his father. Because remember me, it is this expression is related to the concept of purgatory, that his ghost has come from purgatory, he has not come from hell. And in purgatory, one is spends only some time. That means the stay in purgatory is just temporary. And he also wants Hamlet to do many things, maybe charity, maybe organizing mass, maybe doing all those things which we also see in our country. Say, for example, dead are remembered when you offer charity to poor people. So there was this school of thought there. But you know that the very institution of purgatory was banned in England, abolished. And similarly, there came a time when Roman Catholicism, in fact, or say Catholic Church, or people associated with say Catholicism, they were hounded, and in Shakespeare's own time, and so much so that there is also this question in Shakespeare's scholarship, who was Shakespeare's, what was Shakespeare's father's religion, and if Shakespeare was Protestant, was or whether Shakespeare was a Catholic but he was hiding his religious faith, and he was just giving this impression to others that he was a Protestant. So that means this particular phrase, remember me, because it is the Catholic institution which talks about all those institutions where dead are remembered by, say, charity, by the organization of mass, and so on. So here, one word, but wealth of information. Unromantic business, but wealth of information. Lastly, I would like to say in the next 5 minutes, I would like to mention one another important writer and closer to us, Sadat Hasan Manto. And you know that Sadat Hasan Manto is one writer who has written a lot about partition. And even historians use Sadat Hasan Manto's stories as very important, say, resource for their work. And why is Sadat Hasan Manto important? And one very interesting book, it is written by Aisha Jalal, The Pity of Partition. It is also a biography of Manto. And here I'm quoting these words from Aisha Jalal's book. Poets, creative writers, artists, and filmmakers have captured the pity of partition quite as much as the pity of war for defenseless people far more effectively than have academic historians bound by their disciplinary conventions. Right? That means historians can sometimes be bound by disciplinary conventions, and often they have not paid enough attention to other genres of writing. And here, say, he makes a case for literature also. And she also mentions Lawrence Stone, who in fact also provided, say, some kind of impetus to a particular kind of writing which historians know, the kind of narrative writing. And today also we see that this kind of narrative writing is very, very, say, popular. See, often if we talk about history at popular level, we are not talking about history which is non-serious, which rather we are talking about history which has that very strong element of narrative and which can be read by people. Of course, it also uses all those serious sources. So there is creative tension between what Lawrence Stone categorized as fictional and historical narratives. It is possible to chalk out a new interdisciplinary way of reconnecting the histories of individuals, families, and individuals, families, communities, and states in the throes of cataclysmic change. Of course, Manto was very much in the throes of cataclysmic change. So he was living through the violence of partition, and most of his stories, not all. So this is also very important that usually Manto is considered a writer of partition. He's not simply a writer of partition. He has written many other stories. Muhammad Bhai is not about partition, right? Say, I mean, and many other stories which I can mention. So here, her point is that micro historical detail can illuminate the texture of macro historical change. So, what is micro historical? That means a person's own life, and in this case, the biography of a person. In this case, the biography of Manto. And you know that Lawrence Stone talked about use of narrative in history writing, a kind of descriptive history rather than analytical one, in his influential essay. And this essay is very much there, available online. The Revival of Narrative: Reflections on New Old History. So, for him, history has a pregnant principle. What is important here is that micro histories have both these features, right? Clifford Geertz, the famous anthropologist, he talked about the concept of thick description. And you know that how he took his idea of thick description from literary critics, especially those critics who followed the method of close reading, where they offered a close reading of text. And here, Clifford Geertz, anthropologist, he used the method of thick description, close reading, to talk about aspects of culture. That means how say certain aspects of culture can possibly possess rich possibilities. So here, if we talk about micro histories, then micro histories can share certain features with fiction, with short story, in the sense that they have a very strong sense of narrative. They have a very strong sense of, say, character setting, and of course they should not compromise with facts, but it can certainly make history interesting. I remember say my say writer Mark Twain. I worked on Mark Twain. Mark Twain was very fond of Macaulay, and especially how Macaulay could bring certain important historical details to life, or he could provide life to certain important details. Okay, but that is not very relevant here in this case. Now, as far as Manto's stories are concerned, they are important sources for historians because they seriously unsettle the dominant communitarian mode of analyzing partition violence, no projection of national ideologies. Now, here, this this observation is very important. We often have certain narratives which are written because of certain status concerns, because of the concerns of the post-colonial state. So, for example, Pakistan may have different concerns, India may have different concerns. And I was thinking about one particular, say, aspect of ancient history. See, for example, many of those important historical sites, Mohenjo-daro, Mohenjo-daro, for example, they are in Pakistan. But I don't think Pakistan traces its historical roots to that particular period. Obviously, there is that compulsion of statist ideology, and this also means that Pakistan can possibly leave this whole project to others. That means disowning something, disowning a very rich legacy because of certain statist say concerns. Now here, when Manto writes, Manto is not following any statist ideology. Manto is not following the statist ideology of the post-colonial state. Manto is not siding with Hindus. Manto is not siding with Muslims. Manto's stories are anything but communal. And so you can say that you read any stories of Manto. So whether it is Toba Tek Singh or whether it is Kholdo, Manto is equally critical. But one important thing in Manto, and that has been discussed by a number of commentators, that in Manto we also find hope. That means even in the worst of moments, when a character appears completely devoid of humanity, he still retains a touch of humanity. That means there is this optimism that humanity may not be lost even in murderers. So important thing about Manto is that no status narrative. And of course, another point is Manto's highly celebrated letters to Uncle Sam. He wrote those letters. They are written in a very ironic manner. He makes fun of, say, Uncle Sam. He makes fun of America's concerns. He makes fun of Pakistan's growing relationship with America. But they are also fabulous source to track Pakistan's exit from the British orbit as it moved to embrace post-war American strategic imperatives. And the last important point, that 2 points, there is also one particular genre that is called poetry of witness. Poetry of witness. Now, this is a very important genre, and it was made especially popular by one particular anthology which was titled Against Forgetting 20th Century Poetry of Witness. Now, what is the meaning of poetry of witness? That means the poet is living maybe in a war zone, the poet is living in a period of violence, the poet is seeing persecution, the poet is seeing violence, the poet is seeing suppression. And when he writes, somehow he also becomes a kind of witness to those things. Bertolt Brecht, say made this very interesting observation. And we can also recall one very interesting observation, if, say, which was made after Holocaust. And the observation is poetry possible after the Holocaust? Is poetry possible after the Holocaust? Now, a similar kind of observation is, and it comes in the form of a poem, in these dark times, will there also be singing? In these dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will be singing about the dark times. This is poetry of witness. So, poetry of witness can be read as alternative history. I once reviewed one very interesting book, which this is titled Detainees Speak, Poem from Guantanamo Bay. Actually, this is a collection of poems written by many prisoners who were living in darkness, who were not shown any consideration, who were not even facing trials, who were not even provided basic amenities of life. And sometimes they wrote their poems with blood on whatever things which were available before them, or sometimes they wrote something on the walls. Later, some human rights lawyers and others, they in fact collected those poems, and they in fact published this book, Detainees Speak, Poems from Guantanamo Bay. So this is also an example of poetry of witness. Similarly, we can talk about many Palestinian poets, right, who are considered poet. Even somebody like Agha Shahid Ali, when he talks about Kashmir, his poetry is also considered poetry of witness, right? So that means this is one important genre. And if we just take some common examples, which I am sure that everyone of you must have followed. If you think about some recent songs, like for example, Amir Aziz very famous song, "Sab yaad rakha jayega, sab yaad rakha jayega." Now this can also be considered a poetry of witness. Maybe not now, but maybe later it can be considered poetry of witness. The last point, and I don't think I'll need to say any, I need to explain this because we don't have time. Many postmodernist novels, they use history, and there is often a blurring of boundaries between fiction and other genres. Say, for example, Truman Capote's famous work, his famous work is In Cold Blood. Here you can see reportage, newspaper reports, fiction, essay, all combined in a work. So this you see that a kind of genre mixing. This is one example of a postmodernist novel. Similarly, many novels which are considered historiographic metafiction, which talk about history, and often they treat those areas in history where history is silent or where history is not too concerned with certain details. So they fill up those areas with their imagination. And metafiction, because these novels are written with this awareness that they are novels, they give this impression that we are writing novels, right? They are not giving this impression that this is something else, or this is a real work, or this is not fiction, but rather they are written with that element of self-referentiality. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to interact with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Asim Siddiqui. Uh, as you rightly said, that literature does provide much information as far as history is concerned. You started with European authors and ended with a very pertinent, mm, slogan, which one of the modern poets has coined, "Sab yaad rakha jayega." I think that sums up your lecture. कि वाकई जो भी लिटरेचर पे लिखा जा रहा है, जो भी हो रहा है, वो एक अक्कासी है इस जो वाकयात गुजरते हैं और they are noted by the intellectuals and the others who experience them. Let us, if with your permission, start with certain of the questions which have been asked. Mirza Hasnan asks a question. Sir, Christopher Marlowe, who is considered one of the greatest English dramatists, wrote a famous play titled Tamerlane the Great, which was based on Thamuz. And John Dryden, upon whom Age of Dryden of English literature is named, wrote his famous play titled Aurangzeb. So, do we find more such examples of written works in English literature which were based on Mughals or Delhi Sultans of India?
Uh, at the moment, actually, I cannot. I mean, there are definitely works, and this is one particular area which is also known as the area of literary Orientalism. Now, here, very quickly, one particular very famous poem, Kubla Khan, comes to my mind, written by Coleridge. But since this question is about Mughal kings, maybe at the moment I'm not able to recall, but definitely there are. Definitely there are. Because, uh, say, many important writers, especially, say they were inspired by the East, and sometimes their interest also qualifies as a kind of Orientalism, right? So many of those, say, kings or many of those rulers, they definitely say figure in English literature. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Asim Siddiqui. Let's have the second question. Another similar question by Ali Haider. Uh, okay, a question by Hassan Aziz. Sir, can you suggest some great novels or other genre of literature written on partition of 1947?
There are actually number of works on partition. Bapsi Sidhwa's work, or say for that, Khushwant Singh's work, and you'll find that partition actually, or even Kurtul and Haider's Akadaria, or Mere Bhi Sanam Khane, you'll find that partition literature is a very rich area, and whether it is poetry or whether it is fiction, you'll find number of works. if
Uh,
you just google if you just google this partition literature or novels about partition, at one click I'm sure that you'll find say number of works.
right. There's a question by Ali Haider. Sir, can you suggest some great novels based on Mughals, Nawabs, and Delhi Sultans of India? And do you think poetry is the perfect source for reading history, as it can sometimes be based on far fetched excesses, exaggerations of glory, and facts like in case of poetic epic of Padmavat, Futuh Salatin, etc.?
Actually, the first part of the question, I mean, it was just addressed. So, if we think about the later part of your question, say poetry is the perfect source for reading history as it can sometimes be based on far-fetched excesses. I would say that reading poetry also requires some kind of training, right? So that means whenever there is a reference in poetry, whenever there is a kind of allusion in poetry, it is not simply that allusion, but it is also the tone of the poet which is important. It is also the placing of that particular word, its repetition or single reference. All these can be important in poetry. So here you mentioned epic, and if you compare epic and if you compare epic with possibly a lyric or with any other form of poetry, you'll find that they follow different conventions. So maybe this particular aspect where one talks about glory or you talk about say far-fetched excesses, maybe this can be there in an epic, because epic is talking about those grand figures, those great characters. It is talking about a scale which is very, very massive. It is talking about a setting which again is very, very grand. And so here, maybe these things are relevant, but not always in other forms of poetry.
Right. So let's have another question. Muhammad Aftab Ali. While taking his account, Michael Foucault's influences on literary and historical traditions, as all of his works are based on historical, archaeological, like in The Order of Things, Madness and Civilization, Discipline and Punishment, History of Sexuality, and Birth of Cleric. One can also not discount and ignore Jacques Derrida's paradigm of deconstruction on literature and historiography. Secondly, at a point of time when we are talking about literature as window to history, how do you see the works of, and I can't see what's written beyond that. I think after Balam, you should divide your question into two. Answer the first question.
And Jacques Derrida, of course, one cannot discount Jacques Derrida. But here, I must make this observation that both Foucault and Derrida, actually, they do not talk about literature too much. It is their ideas actually which have been taken by some of these literary critics. And here, Michel Foucault, why Michel Foucault is important? Because one can also see a particular kind of literary politics in the American academia, where, say, deconstruction with say Jacques Derrida at the center was a very important source at Yale University, and that's why you'll see that many of those important names in deconstructive theory, whether it was Hillis Miller who just died recently, and Geoffrey Hartman, they were all followers of Jacques Derrida, and that's why say deconstruction had a very important presence in American academy, especially in Yale University. But when deconstruction traveled from United States of America to Britain, you'll see that it hardly made any impact there. And what else is there, that because Derrida was writing in French, so even when Derrida's ideas were taken up in American Academy or in English literary criticism, say Derrida there has been domesticated. That means the cutting edge of many of his ideas was taken away, and only some of those ideas which could be tamed, they were applied by critics. That means there is a very selective reading of Derrida, and later Derrida himself was not very happy with how deconstruction made its presence in American academy. And especially one particular observation of Derrida is very important. He said that all my work would not have been possible without Karl Marx, and that's why he also wrote a work which was a kind of tribute to the great say thinker. So what actually Derrida is making this point, that somehow his ideas were reduced to a wordplay, kind of wordplay, and deconstruction is a more subversive kind of ideology which also tried to take issues with power, and essentially it developed at a particular point of time in France when you see French state appeared on the point of collapse, because there were demonstrations of students, demonstration of workers, and the French state used all its power to suppress that important movement. So, what is the point of Derrida? Derrida's point is that deconstruction was also a kind of political weapon, political ideology, where it could possibly attack powers or powers that be. And in literary criticism, that aspect of challenge to power has not been sufficiently highlighted. Rather, it was simply the verbal aspect, wordplay, which made Derrida say popular. So it is more like when you say that deconstruction is deconstruing something, not following something, or the concept of misreading. So I'm not discounting Derrida, but Foucault, in fact, appeared more relevant, especially in California, Berkeley, because Derrida spent time at Yale and Foucault spent time at California, Berkeley. And that's why you see that new historicism had a very important presence where Foucault spent some time. And Foucault's ideas probably were more relatable to new historicists. But again, it will be a mistake to very neatly separate Foucault and Derrida, or to neatly separate certain aspects of theory, that because at the end of the day, all theories are interconnected. All theories probably say somehow relate to each other. Sometimes because they are a reaction against another theory, but even when they are a reaction, they possibly join issues with previous theories.
Uh, uh, Aisha Munira, Dr. Aisha Munira has a question for you. You didn't mention the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, maybe on purpose. Where do you situate it in either of Kundra's categories of fiction?
I'm afraid I haven't read this novel, so I cannot comment on this Ministry of Utmost Happiness. Maybe
Right.
I'll read.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Uh, there are a number of other questions which have been put up, but I hope that we would be able to take them at some later point of time because you know we have already crossed 1.5 hours. Lashmikant Mishra ji has a
Yeah, I
question.
can. Yeah, I
If
can
you
relate to
can
this question.
very quickly answer that,
Yeah,
very
actually,
quick.
I have read this work, so probably I can relate to this. I mean, maybe 15 years ago, I read this work, Raj Syndrome, and it's a beautifully written work. And I, I was thinking about one novel, uh, say where one particular detail in this work, Raj Syndrome, and the novel that I had in my mind was Somerset Maugham's short novel say up at the villa. Now, what we see up at the villa, say there is one particular character who is 54, who is unmarried, and who wants to be the governor general of, India, and he plays tennis, he plays, say he keeps fit, and at the age of 54 also he say doesn't look old. Now, in Raj syndrome, say Sohas say discusses certain colonial perceptions, and he discusses at length Kipling's say view, and Kipling's mantra was be fit, be fit, be fit. That means say the colonial power never wanted to show any weakness in its officers, any physical weakness in its officers. And that's why whenever we see representations of those colonial masters, whether in films or in other places, we see that they appear fit, they appear athletic. Just compare the representation of those say colonial masters in Amir Khan's film Lagan. You'll see that they all appear so fit. They all appear like Virat Kohli. So here, when we I try to relate this particular work up at the villa, and try to see many of those colonial perceptions, and the figure of Elliot, who is 54, who plays tennis, who keeps fit, who has all those attitudes, and despite spending so much time in India, he possibly could never think of marrying a local girl. That means aspects these are all aspects which Suhas Chakravarti has beautifully discussed, especially those perceptions, right? And of course, I mean, his work can be very usefully studied by students who are reading certain novels. I thought about another work, Tarun Tejpal's novel, The Alchemy of Desire. There also, say, one can see this particular element, that this relationship between the native and the Englishman, how, say, forbidden it was at one particular point of time.
Well, Aisha Munira ji says, Dr. Munina says that a very scintillating talk, no doubt. I agree with her. Then she says, good that I didn't miss it. I would urge her to attend the other lectures as well, where English literature is not involved. I think she would love them as well. So we have an interesting series, and Asim Saab has been, in fact, one of the inspirations behind this because at a time when I knew nothing about how to handle online things, it was he who goaded me. He set by example by started taking lectures and he started guiding me what to do. I asked him, "भाई
Okay.
इसको PowerPoint कैसे दिखाया जाएगा?" And it was he
You are
who
too
tried to
generous.
And so yes, and so we started together, and since the very beginning when we started the series, we were interested to have Asim Saab with us. I am really thankful that it was after 6 months, when we were completing 6 months, in fact, entering the seventh, we were able to have Asim Saab with us. Asim Saab, literature and history is a very interesting topic. I think the writing of history itself started with literature. Who can forget Mahabharata and Ramayana for the reconstruction of India's past? I mean, still most of the, I mean, 95% of the Indians think that that is history. And it is history, of course, because it is from literature that quite a few things we try to sift using our historians' tools. Even when you come to the historical past, the way we divide history is the study of a period for which we have literally written records. Prehistory is everything where everything was, just by mouth, just recitation. So Mahabharata and Ramayana may be, prehistoric texts, but then even coming to the medieval period, where we start our study of the history of Delhi with uh, Chandra Bardai's Prithviraj Raso, which is nothing but a bardic literature. I mean, it's we know that it today consists of thousands of verses, but historians have, in fact, worked and found that it's only a couple of hundred of verses which are actually those of Chandra Bardai, and that based on that we try to study, sift the sand from the actualities, and we try to get what how
Mm.
the origins of
Actually,
Delhi were.
yeah. Actually,
Uh,
you also have the authority of Namvar Singh. He
and
also wrote this essay.
yes, yes. I would also like to mention Professor Asim Siddiqui, the works of Amir Khusro. I mean,
Yes.
the history of Sultanate would not be complete until unless we take into account Deval Rani Khizr Khan, for example, or Noh Se Peher of Amir Khusro. Uh,
Absolutely.
these are the texts. In fact, the first reference to the concept of India as a whole nation, as a whole country, nation within inverted commas, Hindustan, that is given from the Kashmir down to the oceans, down to the south. That is for the first time provided by Amir Khusro in No Sepeher, for that matter. Not only that, we know of Malik Muhammad Jaisi's Padmavat. It gained currency, so much currency during the past few years. I mean, the myth makers trying to use it, the historians trying to correct it. What was Jaisi actually trying to communicate to us? In his literary language, which was distorted and misquoted by the modern myth making historians of Hindutva Brigade. Then, of course, there is much research and much work has been done on Mullah Daud's Chandayan. Very serious kind of research has been done basing on that. You have already mentioned one of the modern writers of India, Manto. You analyzed him here, apart from giving us a perspective from Europe, starting with Shakespeare and others. In fact, just as you talked about Shakespeare, whether he really existed or not, number one. Number two, whether every of the novel which is attributed to him are basically attributes or written by him. Similar questions have been raised about Amir Khusro. Similar questions have been raised about a large number of these poets and writers in the Indian context as well. I mean, the jury is still out as far as Amir Khusro is concerned. I mean, if you join any of the cultural groups, they would be narrating certain verses. कि ये अमीर खुसरो ने ये कहा. Most of it, 80% of it, is just attributes, but giving a very beautiful idea about the country. And of course, I was wishing and hoping that someone would mention Pakiza. that famous novel which depicts the 19th century culture of Lucknow, Awadh. I think the whole culture of Awadh can never be understood but for this novel. So, in fact, I would agree with Professor Asim Siddiqui that there is history in the novels, and as far as history is concerned, there is much literature into it. And I would thank Asim Saab once again for drawing our attention to many of the theoretical aspects whom we historians, at least in India, at least at places like Aligarh, do not pay attention to. We are still busy in looking at the economics of the period. We forget that, I mean, these aspects which you were, sir, discussing today are equally, if not more important. Uh, we would end this by once again, I'll be quoting one of the sentences of Asif Saab, सब याद रखा जाएगा, जो भी होगा वो नोट होगा, और बाद में आने वाला ज़माना उसको एक हिस्टोरिकल कॉन्टेक्स्ट में, यहाँ तक कि हमारे प्रोग्राम को भी उसी कॉन्टेक्स्ट में देखा जाएगा कि हमारी भी एक अटेम्प्ट थी कि मिथ को दूर करके और हिस्ट्री को कैसे सही से समझा जाए, उसकी तरफ एक छोटा सा कदम हम बढ़ाते हुए आगे बढ़ते रहेंगे. And I hope that you people will keep us joining in the coming weeks as well. We have beautiful lectures lined up for the next sessions. We have, for example, on 12th of March, we have Samira Sheikh, who would be speaking on how to say law in Gujarat. And then on 14th of March, we have Shaleen Jain, who would be talking about the Jain sources and Mughal Farmans. But don't forget that you have to join us once again tomorrow for the Women's Day special. We would be having, a beautiful session. I am hoping a very interesting session, which would be moderated by Professor Farhat Hassan of DU, along with two very young speakers who would be telling us about the position of women in Rajputana and under the Mughals. With these words, I thank once again Professor Asim Siddiqui, and I hope that all of you would be joining us tomorrow at 8 o'clock for the women's special. Thank you and good night.